VR can be an incredibly demanding medium, especially if you are running a high-end headset which is pushing pixel counts far beyond even 4K, and for many, acceptable performance starts at 72 to 90 FPS. Both factors which can make the mightiest of GPUs buckle at such high resolutions. Merely look at how my 5090 is struggling to provide that kind of performance right now. But this is where there have been several community tools which have been made to add in various forms of upscaling and sharpening to mitigate this drop, such as the VR Performance Toolkit and the OpenXR Toolkit. These can add in forms of upscaling such as FSR and NIS to improve performance, but with a lower impact on visual fidelity in theory. Or you can just also lower the resolution with CAS sharpening to improve the quality. Just look at how my performance improves using FSR versus native rendering. It is far more playable. However, these are long since depreciated, and certain games you cannot use them in because of how it's done. A notable example of this would be VRChat, as due to EAC, the VR Performance Toolkit is blocked, so no FSR, NIS, or sharpening for you. And with the OpenXR Toolkit no longer maintained, with more games using DirectX 12 now, which compatibility on that is sketchy at best, the stuff you can use it in is lowering, and notable games, such as Metro Awakening, cannot use it for this reason. But there are still a lot of games which you can use both these methods for, at least, even if it's not universal. And it's those we are going to be taking a look at today, because recently, Pimax has integrated these forms of upscaling as a native part of their software stack, which has enabled them to be used in almost anything, even in games where they don't normally work. Yes, that does include VRChat. But is the performance jump really worth using, and is the hit-to-image quality better than simply lowering your resolution and applying some sharpening? As this is also a feature Pimax has recently added in an option for those other tools I just mentioned. Well, that's why we're going to take a look at these today, modded or natively, and they should if they should be given your time. But some of you may be confused by all these terms I'm throwing out. FSR, NIS, CAS. What do all these mean, right? FSR stands for Fidelity FX Super Resolution, while NIS is Nvidia Image Scaling. These are both forms of upscaling, one by AMD, the other by Nvidia, but they are not vendor exclusive, where the basic principle is that you take a lower resolution input image and then upscale that to a higher resolution output, with the idea being that you use various algorithms to preserve more image detail than simply downsampling from native. These are spatial upscalers, so they mainly work on what's present on the screen in front of them. This is contrasted by DLSS or later versions of FSR, which are temporal based and accumulate information over time based on past frames to help reconstruct the image. By the nature of being spatial upscalers, this means they generally provide lower quality than something like DLSS, but this also means they can avoid the slight blur that you get when using temporal solutions, since both DLSS, though DLSS 4 does kind of somewhat address this, and FSR from 2.0 or beyond are derived from similar principles. In VR, some people just hate this technology because of the blur it causes. The difference can be seen with something like Kayak VR, where TAA has more blurred details but no shimmering, whereas no TAA has more shimmer, but it's a little sharper in what you can see. On the other hand, we have CAS, which stands for Contrast Adaptive Sharpening. This is also by AMD. One can do upscaling with this, yes, but it's meant more for making an image crisper using sharpening algorithms to bring out more detail. Not unlike a sharpening filter in an image editor, if anyone has experience with that. And Pimax also added this to their standalone sharpening option. When it comes to VR, all three of these can be powerful tools to claw back performance. While the general idea being that you would use FSR and NIS to upscale the image, or you could lower the resolution slider and then just apply some CAS to make up for the detail loss somewhat, depending on your preferences. So let's start with a quick performance analysis before getting into the image quality and some of the limitations of these. Test configuration wise, I have a 9950X3D, RTX 5090, 64GB of 6000 MHz DDR5 RAM, and then all run on the Pimax Crystal Super here at 90Hz mode. Concerning resolution, I will be referencing the resolution slider in Pimax Play. The full 1.0 in the software res or high setting is 6240 by 6280 per eye. I use Pimax upscaling as a base target since that's what I'm comparing to and it's easier to match resolutions. Their chosen upscaling does not exactly match what you would get on their resolution slider. For example, quality mode came out to 4800 by 4828 per eye, which is about 77% of the 100% res going by per axis scaling. But setting that manually got me 4828 by 4856 per eye, which was the closest I could resolution match. As the VR Performance Toolkit toolkit also uses per axis scaling. To keep things easier to follow and not waste a bunch of time reading resolutions, I'll be listing the render res in the bar charts coming up. In the case of the VR Performance Toolkit, I will be listing what I use in the config file. As for those, I set my render res to 1.0 and then use the appropriate settings in the configuration file. So that's using 6240 by 6280 per eye as a reference point to upscale to. The render resolutions doing this are slightly different than trying to manually match via the Pimax slider, yes, but it's like a 1 to 2% difference, guys. It's about identical for all intents and purposes. For each upscaling preset, it can kind of be thought of like this. And again, note, this is per axis scaling of your full res, not the SteamVR resolution slider, which goes off the total pixel count. I've also set the sharpening value to 0.6 for all these tests which were involved. By default, Pimax uses 0.1 to 0.6 depending on the preset, more based on how heavy your upscaling is, and I want to isolate the sharpening as a potential performance variable. Secondly, a major disclaimer for anyone who wants to test this themselves. At present, there is a notable bug right now with FPS VR and Pimax's native upscalers. For some really odd reason, if you launch FPS VR while running this, in some titles, it causes quite the notable FPS loss. The program will say the frame times seem like they are probably accurate, but not the FPS, and this is reflected inside the headset and how it feels when FPS drops. If you've been through that, you know exactly what I mean. I didn't have this in every game, but it did happen to a good number of them. So I don't recommend FPS VR when testing this right now, and I'm not using it here just in case it could have some other issues. Mod does seem fine at least though. This does not appear to happen when just running sharpening at a lower resolution though, thankfully. It also mostly doesn't appear to affect the results when using other FPS overlay tools, such as the OpenXR Toolkit or RTSS, but those do also report the FPS drop that opening FPS VR causes. There is one result we'll talk about later, which may still be affected, and I did not use any monitoring tools like RTSS, but just the basic capture service from CapFrameX. But point is, I double checked this with enough tools and validated them that I think CapFrameX is presenting here it's reasonably accurate. I'll be using milliseconds between display change metric within it, which can be found on the 1.7.5 and higher beta updates for the software. I discussed why in another video if anyone's curious. Also, when I say native res in this video, I refer to the resolution without any form of upscaling, even if it's downsampling from the full 1.0 res. VR and the whole idea of native resolution is a little bit complicated. So, this said, let's take a look at some games. A little smaller selection here, given all the different parameters to test per game, and a sizable amount of my test suite supports better upscalers like DLSS. So, first up is Project Wingman, run on the settings on screen that are high, but not quite max, and it is a game demanding enough that just quality upscaling won't cut it on the Super, and it also can have the VR Performance Toolkit injected so we can compare with Pimax's native usage and multiple levels of upscaling. Checking the full 1.0 res, it's pretty much unplayable. Not much else to say besides sharpening, has no real overhead. Moving on to 0.77 or quality upscaling, we get a huge boost in performance that brings us to around 70 FPS average, give or take a little. Most of this is all within run-to-run variance of 1 to 2%, I'd call near identical, but there are some notable exceptions. If we look at Pimax's native usage of upscaling, most of the other runs are 3 to 4% ahead. Close, but enough to call it out. Using FSR, however, there's actually a meaningful gap that can reach as high as 7 to 8% in favor of the average FPS or lows for the other runs. This could just be FSR having higher overhead here, as if we look at the modded usage of it, while the average FPS and 1% low are in step with everything, it has the worst 0.1% low for this segment of the chart by a high margin. Every other run is doing 7 to 10% better on this metric. Again, with the exception of Pimax's FSR, that's only around a 2% lead. But if we go all the way down to balance level upscaling or 0.53 render scale, and we check out Pimax's use of FSR versus the mod is meaningfully ahead in the lows, being 7 to 9% better depending on the metric. With this heavy upscaling, we are slamming solidly into hertz limitations of the headset, going up to only 90, but aside from that 1 point on FSR, it's kind of more or less more the same here. Pimax's upscaling does seem to do slightly worse than the mod, but the best performer is simply using native and downscaling. It's still good to see sharpening also has no meaningful overhead here. This game does have built-in sharpening as well, but from some brief testing, I did not quite match what I could do with external tools. Now we have Automobilista 2 at high settings, everything everything besides MSAA set to the second highest option, on a 21 car track in heavy cloud weather. I don't know if it's possible to mod in FSR NIS without Open Composite, as I couldn't find an easy way to do it, so the mod wasn't used here, but it demonstrated some interesting upscaling behavior with Pimax I want to take a look at. If we look at the native res, the full 1.0 res isn't doing the greatest. Using any level of MSAA is just kind of not viable, as even low, which I believe is ×2, brings us down to the mid-60s. If you're willing to forgo it though, you could manage a reasonably good 72Hz experience. If we compare runs with or versus without sharpening, the difference is only about 1 to 3% overall, but there is a meaningful near 7% lead when comparing no MSAA runs on the 0.1% low. If we go down to 0.77, performance jumps a lot to where even with medium MSAA, which I believe is ×4, we're actually slamming into the limits of the headset being only 90 Hz, some dips below that. The lows when comparing sharpening versus no sharpening do have a swing of around 4%, but oddly, the 1% are in favor of no sharpening, while the 0.1% low is in favor of the sharpening. I did several runs and was just kinda run-to-run variance of a few percent here, so I'd be willing to call it about equal because of this, though. Either way, pretty great boost from 1.0. That makes for an excellent 90 FPS experience, and sharpening has a little cost here. But if we move on to the upscaling results, they're strange. The upscaling, even when using lower levels of MSAA, is performing far worse than simply downsampling to a similar internal res. And while NIS is still doing bizarrely worse than native, it's still doing noticeably better than FSR. These are the kind of FPS drops I saw when starting FPS VR in some other games, so it could possibly be related to that. But I had the RTSS overlay off, and this is the only game I saw this occur with PresentMon, what cap FrameX uses. When trying AMS2 without running any measurement programs too, head movements also felt sluggish in a way that they just don't when you have a locked frame rate. So I think something might just not be working right here. I ran each test several times to validate it, and yeah, these are the correct results for my rig. Perhaps there are still some bugs for Pimax to sort here. But at the very least, downscaling plus sharpening works without issues here. Ready to make the 5090 bleed is Skyrim VR with Mad God's Overhaul mod list using the June 6th update to be specific, run at stock settings with Mantilla disabled. This supports, and the mod author even encourages, using DLAA with the FSR mod, so I've done exactly that, as I thought it an interesting test with the focus on upscaling, as Foos Heavy supports DLSS. There is no 1.0 res here, as I appeared to be VRAM limited on a 5090, and the game would not launch at 0.77 or above resolution with DLAA. So this is a test of balance and performance upscaling, and I've grouped the results by that. Starting with balanced, or 0.63 native res, performance is in a rough place. For the most part, performance is within a couple percent, but once again, the mod for FSR and NIS are performing slightly better, however, only by around 3 to 6%. The FSR mod again has an unusually low 0.1% low to it versus every other result though. Dropping res all the way down to performance upscaling, or 0.53, the gap between Pimax's implementation and the mods has widened somewhat, with the largest gap being around 8% comparing FSR to FSR. The gap between FSR and NIS has shrunk at this res, though the NIS mod has 8.5% better, 0.1% low oddly. If we check out native res without anything, it actually has the worst 0.1% low at 52 FPS, but Mad God's Overhaul has some more notable run-to-run variants than most games I test, so it could be somewhat that. I did see it after multiple runs though, so I don't know, weird result. Sharpening with CAS via mod or natively is still almost free performance, so I recommend using it no matter what setup you have. And last up is a game that used to allow upscaling via mods but caused some buzz once EAC nixed that ages ago, VRChat. Starting with no MSAA, performance at 1.0 is decent, given this is VRChat, in the low 60 FPS, but those dip into the 40s, hurts a lot. Sharpening only costs about 1 to 2% performance, basically nothing. You will generally tend to be CPU bound in this game versus GPU, but if you have a top-end CPU, it's really not unreasonable that you could push for more frames with these resolutions, so that's why we have the upscale and lower res results. With no MSAA, performance jumps, getting up to plus 31% on average FPS when comparing 0.77 res, and an absurd near 51% gains on the 1% low. You absolutely feel that in VR. However, the 0.1% low rises by a far lower amount, with the greatest gap being only plus 24% on the run with sharpening. It's not too surprising given how VRChat can be though, once again. FSR is doing slightly worse on average FPS, with every similar internal res run 3 to 4% better there, just barely enough to mention. This also holds for the 1% low, where the gap widens to 4 to 8% depending on the run. This continues to the established trend of FSR having a slight, but present, performance overhead versus the other options. We've got the headroom at lower res and there's dips anyway, so may as well flick on MSAA, and the 5090 doesn't have a very high drop from it. 0.1% low don't really change, but 1% low and average FPS do go down to where the higher res runs are doing about 10 to 21% better there without MSAA. Still impressive how everything is managing over 73 FPS average given the res that we are at. Unlike before, FSR and NIS are performing almost identically. However, using native res, with or without sharpening, is up to several percent better, which is still nothing special, but just enough to be statistically significant with how every last frame matters in VR. Surprisingly, going to MSAA times 4 sees an incredibly minor performance drop. It's present, as just using times 2 does around 6 to 8% better versus these same parameters with times 4. But the trends are mostly the same. Simply downsampling native performs better than the upscalers by a razor-thin margin. NIS and FSR are within a few percent of each other at most, and we're still getting much better performance than native while doing a decent job preserving image quality. So, there is the performance analysis. Let's discuss a few takeaways before we get to image quality. Speaking on pure performance, you can get quite a lot of it back by dropping your resolution or using even lighter, sometimes moderate upscaling. Some games, namely Skyrim and Project Wingman, saw some massive swings from unplayable to decent, even good frame rates, and VRChat enabled higher levels of MSAA to be used while performing better than the much higher native res. And that kind of downsampling or upscaling is definitely viable on these super high resolution headsets coming up like the Super and the Megane X or the Play for Dream. Even running in the around 4x4 to 5K per eye range, it just looks fantastic. And running at those resolutions is way more viable for non-5090 systems. In fact, I have a 5090 laptop, which I'm doing some testing on right now, and I have a few basic results to show at this moment. I'll just briefly flash through a few games, pause if you want to look closer, full video coming on that someday. Top-end 5090 mobile is around desktop 5070 Ti level, slightly better from what I've seen. Benchmark video on that coming someday. Now that I've used it for a video, that counts as a business expense. Tax man can't get me! Joking aside, personally, I would recommend just downsampling the resolution and using sharpening when possible, particularly with Pimax's native usage. By going down to a similar internal resolution you're upscaling from, native res performs roughly the same, and it actually does slightly better even. Plus, there are kind of some weird kinks with it, where opening FPS VR causes frame drops, and some games, like Automobilista 2, they just kind of behave weird and you don't really get much performance. It's simpler to just lower your res and apply sharpening. This doesn't appear to happen so much with the modded version, which does perform slightly better in my testing. Not a whole lot, but hey, several percent can sometimes matter in VR. However, when we get to the image quality and compatibility discussion, things do get a lot better for Pimax's native integration versus the mod. You can't really tell from a direct game capture recording unless making some more extreme comparisons, like performance upscaling versus native res here. And even that only tells half the story versus the visuals inside the headset. I think most people who've tried recording footage can attest to that. So you'll have to just trust me on this because I don't have a very good camera to get quality through the lens easily, and that itself is not the best measure either. But when comparing upscalers, I'd say Pimax has a win on sharpness here. Versus the mod, like OpenXR Toolkit or VR Performance Toolkit, I wouldn't say it's gigantic, but it just feels like there's a subtle increase in sharpness, which makes things generally more clean and crisp to look at, especially on text. And I'd say it's more than worth the minor performance loss alongside the ease of use. If we compare CAS via the mod to Pimax's own usage, though, well, I'd say they feel about identical. Which isn't surprising, given Pimax is also using CAS. Now, there are some slight differences, but generally at similar sharpening values, I found things overall look pretty samey. FSR had perhaps a tad softer and less aliased image, whereas NIS could be sharper, sometimes a little over-sharpened, with native plus sharpening kind of somewhere in the middle. Sharpening is just amazing in VR, and if you've never tried it yourself, you are missing out. When running at 0.77 resolution and using CAS on the Super here, I would honestly say that for close to medium-ish length objects that aren't super small details, such as say a chunk of the starting area in VRChat, it actually manages to look kind of close to 1.0 res without it, even if not quite there. But it sure performs a hell of a lot better. More further and distant details, yeah, you can kind of tell it's lower resolution because of some extra shimmer, but sometimes you just really need that extra performance. And in some games, you're kind of playing in more narrow areas, not like trying to look at that mountain you can climb over there. Personally, I'd recommend around 0.4 to 0.7, depending on what your preference is, be you using the mod or Pimax's software. But don't just take my word for how amazing this feature is. You can try it for free quite easily. Just download something like AirCar for free on Steam, grab the VR Performance Toolkit from GitHub, and follow the install instructions for where to put it, and set the config files to look like this, adjusting sharpening to your desired value. You can play around with FSR and NIS if you want to, but make sure again you follow the instructions so you are upscaling appropriately. Now, this all said, I think that these features are definitely worth using. Not just for Pimax, I think FSR, NIS, and CAS can be useful for everyone. But especially with higher levels of sharpness, you can retain a surprising amount of detail for a decent performance bump, or improve already good visuals if you are happy with your performance. Seriously, 1.0 with sharpening on this thing looks godlike. Generally, the preference would just be downsample your resolution and use CAS, but there are some cases where NIS or FSR can look better on your preferences. Although, once again, do be mindful of the bugs right now with Pimax's native usage of it. If you do use these tools, at least on super high resolutions like the Super, I think even going down to balanced upscaling can look pretty fine, even if there's obvious trade-offs there. While quality level upscaling can look very impressive at this resolution. From some brief testing on the lower PPD Crystal Light, which is about 35 versus the 50 of this, I generally try to stick to quality level upscaling as the visual sacrifices do start becoming greater, but balance can be passable if you do truly need it. But on the other hand, if you do use some heavier upscaling or lower your resolution aggressively, it's possible to throw on higher levels of MSAA, which make for a lot less shimmer, even if a somewhat softer image via the physically lower resolution. If a game supports DLSS, you really should just use that for upscaling though, as it is the superior method, especially if you combine it with sharpening for just a magnificent image. Personally, I think these features are actual good selling points for Pimax to have them natively, and more vendors need to do this. Yes, there are a lot of games anyone can use them in via mods, and some games even have native toggles for some of these, like say Kayak VR has a sharpening slider. But a number of the games in the library just don't work with the mods. I really do hope we see more VR vendors start adding these things, sharpening especially on their software, particularly cable DisplayPort headsets. CAS is open source and it's basically a free visual upgrade that may be my favorite feature of the entire software stack of Pimax after Quad-View's DFR. And yes, I know things like Virtual Desktop have sharpening, so does MesLink sharpening, but in terms of cabled PC VR, I think Pimax and Somnium are, again, the only people who have this feature as part of their software. If there's somebody I'm missing, please do correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But that said, there's the video. Have you tried these features yourself, and were you just as impressed, or think I'm being a little dramatic on them? Have I interested you in giving them a try yourself with these results? Let me know. If you made it to the end here, consider subscribing to see what I do next, but if you don't, well, thanks for sticking around and watching to the end anyway, and maybe I will be recommended to you again sometime. Later.